We're in Chatham, Massachusetts at property of Sarah Dunbar. Has a beautiful property here with a lot of species, plants, trees, and really loves having bees on her property and pollinating all of her flowers. So this is where we are today. So we are going to put the hives together. Four of them.
4 hives?
4 hives. Starting with fairly logical, the bottom board. Any beehive, Langstroh beehive that is, Langstroh.
Langstroh?
Langstroh is the inventor of this particular hive geometry, which calls for a box with 10 frames of foundation, and the distance between any of the objects in the hive are based scientifically on bee space. What it takes, how much room a bee needs to navigate and maneuver through the hive. 3/8 of an inch.
3/8 of an inch?
3/8 between one full frame of comb, another full frame of comb. The bees just work their way around in there, and they do all their work in these narrow gaps between each of the frames that they load up with honeycomb brood for the new workers. Some drones, not very necessary because the queen is already fertilized, and honey. They store food. So they're so good at storing food, they leave a lot, they store too much, and that's what we harvest. Drones, which is the male, they are pretty much useless until and unless a queen needs to be fertilized, at which time they all go off in flight, fertilize the queen, and die immediately thereafter. And the queen is now fertilized. The queen comes back to the hive and begins laying eggs, fertilized eggs and unfertilized eggs. Fertilized eggs produce drones. She doesn't lay many of those because she doesn't need any drones because the queen is already fertilized. And the unfertilized eggs produces worker bees, females. They do all the work. The drones do nothing at all. They get in the way. So,
Interesting commentary on this, the genders.
just saying. All right, so now that we have the board, and each of these has frames of honeycomb already drawn out from the previous batch of bees. Some brand new frames just with a simple dimple imprint of the cell, and a drone frame, which is slightly larger cells, accommodates the drones.
The drones are larger bees?
Slightly larger bees, yes. And the queen is the largest of all. Yeah. And this is where the bees land, enter the hive at the bottom, and then they walk or climb up into the hive, do their thing. A frame, at least one frame of honey. This is full of honey and capped by the bees, and we provide this just for their own food inside the hive. There's also some drawn out comb here with some honey up at the top, which will also serve as some food. So there'll be provisions in here for the bees to sustain themselves, but we'll also add some sugar water on top of these hives when we've got the bees inside. I'm gonna suit up and get ready to play with some bees. Hey, this is my protection. A nice jacket from Dedant. Covers the upper torso. I've got loose fitting, light colored pants on. Whenever you deal with bees, you should wear light colored clothing. Bees think that dark colors are bears or raccoons or some furry animal that they want to come out and sting. So white is a good thing to have. Tan is okay. I started beekeeping in 1987. I took a course at the Norfolk Agricultural High School, Walpole, Massachusetts, bee school. 6-week course, and I graduated magna cum laude. Okay, cum laude.
Did you get certified?
All right, I graduated.
Did you get certified?
I
Is it
am
like a-
certifiably a beekeeper. All right, you can see they're buzzing. They're a little bit aggravated from the drive,
And where'd they come from?
and there are some dead ones at the bottom because they've been traveling for too long. It took too long to get here, so we lost about 10% of them to, death
they-
by traveling.
Where'd they come from?
These, I believe, came from Georgia, but I'm not sure exactly where. From inside the car. I didn't want to carry them in the back of the truck because the wind would batter them around, and
And you're
They
not
can't
worried
get
right
out.
now about holding them without your gloves?
no, because they're inside a cage and there's a screen, and
Mm-hmm.
you know they're contained. They're well contained.
How many bees would you say are in one of these packages?
This contains about 3,000 bees.
And those are
Queen, which is contained in a separate little queen capsule, and I'll show you that when we open these up.
the queen's quarters.
The queen is introduced to the hive very cautiously, because the queen, if it's a new queen in a hive, it's not immediately accepted. They have to assimilate the queen and get used to the queen and the pheromones that the queen releases as part of its own sort of reproductive process and pheromone scent that the bees become accustomed to. So they need several days, sometimes as much as a week, to become accustomed to the queen, so that we know, or so that the queen is safe from being attacked, mauled, suffocated to death. That's what they would do to an invader. So the queen has to be accepted, and then it'll become part of the hive. This queen has been riding in these travel containers with the bees for about 7 or 8 days now. So there's a good chance that the queen is in good shape in terms of being accepted by these bees, but we're not going to take any chances. We're going to use a slow release inside the hive, which I'll show you, to let the queen adapt a little bit more before we release her to the population. It's basically a tin can full of sugar water that the bees have been feeding on for their trip. And there's a cover on this package that I've got to remove, and there's a queen inside the package that's sitting in the population now. 4 frames. dump them in and just let them be a big pile of bees inside the hive before they start spreading around, climbing around, and getting in between all the frames and doing what they do. The other thing I will do is set up the queen inside one of these frames, rubber banded to the frame, so that the queen cage is sitting there suspended inside the hive so that the other bees can become accustomed to the queen before I release her into the population a couple days from now.
Are your bees escaping now?
There are a few that escaped. We don't mind.
And
So
how
now
do
we
they
wanna-
how do they travel? How do they get here?
Usually by U.S. mail. And this is the queen.
She's in a separate compartment.
Whoa. Oh, wow.
What are you doing now?
I'm just scraping the excess bees off of the queen cage. They're all hovering around the queen. It gives me some indication that they're still a little bit too aggressive about this queen in the hive. They're not indifferent, so they're concerned about the queen. So I'm going to put this queen, first check to make sure the queen is alive. Yes, she is. You can see the queen. Let me just get a brush and I'll synthetic brush. If it were a natural bristle, the bees would think it was an animal byproduct and hang all over it, try to sting and attack and that kind of thing. So I'll just brush these into the hive where they'll ultimately be at home. And we can look at the queen. The queen, you can see, is quite a bit larger than the worker bees. There are a few attendants in there keeping the queen happy and healthy. The queen has sort of a large, shinier abdomen than the other bees and is quite a bit larger. Half a dozen attendants in this cage for the trip to keep the queen alive. And what we do is we set this queen cage into the hive and allow the queen and the other bees to eat their way through this candy plug, which takes days. And that's usually enough time for these bees to assimilate the queen. If they'll eat it and work their way through it, and the queen will ultimately come out and not be attacked. So I'm going to take the wood plug out of the end where the candy is, which will allow the bees inside here and inside the hive to start eating this candy and work that queen loose. But as I said, it'll take a while. And I can also see that 2 of the attendants in here are dead. So I won't put this facing down because the attendants could get in the way and clog the exit for the queen. I'll put it in facing up, or at least on an angle, so the queen is not trapped in there.
Where do you want to look up?
I'm just making a little space here. To get sufficient depth. So I've got this now set. The queen is in here, the plug is pulled. There's a slight incline. The workers are not going to get in the way of the queen's escape. So I can now place this queen happily in the hive, in the bee space. I'll have it facing out, I think. And then we'll put the rest of the bees in.
All right.
We'll spray them with a little water that'll calm them down. The water has a little bit of sugar in it. They'll get distracted by that and start cleaning themselves and each other, and that'll keep them busy while I otherwise disrupt their life by knocking them around. And we'll tap them down to the bottom. Remove the cover and unceremoniously dump them into the hive.
A lot of bees flying around right now.
Yeah. And now, in order to keep them well fed, what I'll do is add another frame on top of this, which is actually purpose built to feed the bees. These are little rafts that float in a sea of sugar water. And the bees fly in through this gap, or they crawl in through the gap, up into here, stand on the raft, and eat to their heart's content, and then they bring sugar water back down into the hive where they'll start to store food for themselves. That I will fill with, or not fill completely, but at least top up, load up with some sugar water. And then we'll put an inner cover and an outer cover onto that, and they'll complete the hive. I'll show you that. This, of course, being hive number 3 in our order, starting with north is number 1. So this is an inner cover, it just allows for ventilation in the hive. And there are 2 ways to set it in place. One way has this notch in this configuration, which allows the bees to come in and out here, which we don't want to have happen until they're fully in place, settled in, healthy, and they're starting to really forage for food and building up the hive. So I'll place it this way, which will close them off from getting out from below, but there's a ventilation space here for them, and that keeps them a little bit cool.
There we go.
And that's how the hive will look for the next couple weeks. I'll come back in a few days and make sure the queen is doing well, is it's different from beekeeping inland because the season starts so much later. Spring is cold, and a lot of the nectar flows are quite a bit later. So we're out here loading up these hives. It's now May 29th, and normally inland, somewhere in Westwood, Norwood, or something, we'd already have bees in the hive, productively gathering nectar in a flow by, I don't know, a month earlier, maybe mid-April even. But this has been a cool season, and Chatham is right next to the ocean, which moderates the temperature quite a bit by the ocean temperature. So this season starts up quite a bit later, and it lasts longer in the fall. Bees now, when they find some food source, they'll come back to the hive and they'll tell the other bees where it is, which is remarkable because it's completely dark inside here. But they've got some incredible eyes and the ability to see quite well in the dark. And the bee that found the food will go in, and using vertical as a benchmark, or as a sort of a compass point, will start to tilt off of the vertical axis and waggle. Waggling is indicative of how far the food is, and the vertical axis is where the sun is. So when these bees emerge from the hive, they know if they start flying toward the sun and then they turn right 30 degrees, which is where that waggle was, and go 2 waggles worth of distance, they'll find the food on that vector, which is pretty amazing because bees can actually home in on a source incredibly effectively just by that simple form of communication.
Cut.